Hi and aloha. Welcome to another episode of Maunalua Past, Present, and Future. My name is Kendrick Chang, a youth advisor for Livable Hawaii Kai Hui, a sponsor of this show. And joining me today is Charles Van Rees. Welcome, Charles.
Hi, thanks, Kendrick.
Well, Charles, understand you're a PhD candidate at Tufts University, and you're here over the summer doing a big research project. First of all, why are you here, and what is this research project?
This is a question that I get all the time showing up from Boston to do my work. And so I feel like I'm fairly well practiced in answering it now, but we'll see how quickly I can get through it, because it is sort of a long story. But just sort of put it bluntly, I'm really fascinated by wetland ecology and conservation biology. Hawaii has really, really interesting wetlands as ecosystems themselves, but also as sort of a cultural and natural resource on the island. Water is a very important thing culturally in of course, native Polynesian culture, but also now on the islands as they're becoming urbanized. And so there are a lot of interesting issues around wetland ecology in the world, and I think a lot of them really come to a head in Hawaii, where we have a lot of people in one place relying on these water resources very heavily, and also a lot of unique and endangered wildlife. And so there's a high potential for conflict, and also a lot of very important sort of issues all coming together on this one ecosystem. And that's sort of what drew me in academically. Beyond that, my lab at Tufts University does a lot of work on endangered species. Some students have done work in Hawaii in the past. And I was very intrigued by some of the research done by my lab in the past in this field, specifically with the Alae'ula, the species I work with. So that kind of drew me in.
Sure. And now, you were telling me before we came on air about the Alae'ula and this genetic study and this research. So specifically with the Alae'ula bird, what exactly is your genetic study about?
So this is work that we discussed a little bit with some of the last episodes I did last year with Ōlelo. And essentially, one of the big questions we're trying to ask is whether the small populations of Alae'ula throughout the island are actually related to one another, or whether they're able to be what's called connected to one another by having individuals move between them. As an endangered species, they have very high extinction risk because their populations are so small. And one thing that helps these populations be less at risk is if these small populations can interact by sending individuals between them. It helps buffer their size, it helps keep the populations healthy genetically. Right. So we went around and we collected feather samples from Alae'ula all over the island, from North Shore, Windward Side, Pearl Harbor area. And then I took these to a lab in Alaska, where we analyzed the genes of different birds and different populations and tried to understand, okay, how similar are the gene pools of two different populations. Right. The idea being, if they're similar, then birds must be moving back and forth between them, and there must be what's called gene flow between them. And so, of course, this year now we have results to go on. We have the work that we did last year, and we have those results, and we're getting ready to publish them. And interesting, what we are finding is that a lot of these populations are kind of distinct from one another. We're seeing what's called genetic structure, and this means that birds are not perhaps able to move as often as we'd like between these populations, and they are sort of starting to become independent from one another genetically, which is some concern for the conservation of the species, and it means that maybe some management will be needed in the future to make some adjustments.
Right. And for the viewers, we do have a couple photos of the Alae'ula, and basically there's one particular site in Maunalua, which is the Keawāwa and Keawāwa Wetland complex, which is off of Hawaii Kai Drive. So specifically, how is that area really related to your project?
So I'm really glad you asked that question too, because there's quite a lot I wanted to say about Hawaii and Keawāwa specifically. It's a very small wetland to begin with, and it supports one more small pocket of this species. And what's really important about this particular wetland, or these two wetlands sort of connected to each other, is that they're located somewhere where the majority of the habitat for the species has been lost, and they're sort of a last refuge. Beyond that, they're located sort of strategically right down in the southeast side of the island, where there aren't a lot of habitats. So individual birds that are trying to move, let's say, from the windward side to Pearl Harbor, if they're going around the Ko'olau Mountains, they have a place to stop in Keawāwa. It's sort of a nice little hub for them to go through. So from a landscape perspective and from a species perspective, it's an important place. Interestingly, from our genetic research, we have found that the birds at Keawāwa seem to be of a different genetic makeup than a lot of the other ones on the island, which means they might be the last remnants of a larger population that used to be down in Honolulu and Waikiki and those big wetlands that were all developed. Right. And they might be sort of a relic of a better time for this bird.
Right. And now, I mean, since we are on the Hawaii and Keawāwa Wetland complex, I understand, you've been helping with the restoration efforts with that particular complex. So, I mean, if you want to elaborate on that and share with the audience.
Sure. To my knowledge, there's been a tremendous amount of really amazing restoration work going on at Hawea specifically. A lot of it having to do both with wildlife management and with clearing of vegetation and planting of native species. And it's just been tremendous, people power spent there. And pretty much every time I come back to do my surveys of the Alae'ula at Keawāwa and Hawea, the place looks completely different. And Elizabeth and the rest of the Hui were paying attention, and they really did, give that area some love. And when I came back this year, I found that the birds had moved over there. A new bird had come from somewhere else, who knows, and they'd started breeding, and now they've got keiki there. And from an ecological and conservation biology perspective, this is the best case scenario, is you made habitat, they found it somehow, they showed up, and they started breeding. So it's really a fantastic success story, and I think it speaks to how much more can be done with that property.
Now, specifically with the Hawaii and Keawāwa Wetland, what aspects of that area does attract the Alae'ula to come there? And I mean, especially for the habitat, what features and what does it provide?
Right. So one thing that we're looking for, and my research group is currently sort of trying to get a good handle on exactly what the Alae'ula needs. And what we're seeing right now with sort of our preliminary data from the last couple of years is what they need is sort of an interspersion of taller vegetation with open water and low vegetation. They need sort of a real patchwork, sort of calico pattern to go on. And what we noticed was as soon as there was a little bit of patchiness, a little bit of messiness in the habitat at Hawea, when people started clearing some of the reeds and putting in some of the ʻai, the birds responded. And so what I'm hoping to see there over the long term, and what I'm talking to the Hui about doing in their enhancement plan, is clearing away some of those reeds, but leaving small patches here and there that the birds can hide in and nest in, and that sort of thing, as far as we know, really tends to build up their population. So I did bring some photos along with me, which we'll probably be seeing, where you can actually see a wetland that is managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service specifically for Alae'ula. And these are areas which have these funny little tufts of tall vegetation and some little lawns of stuff for them to eat on and little ponds for them to swim in. And that really seems to drive them in. I mean, their densities are incredible at these places. There are so many that the birds are pushing each other around and getting in fights or whatever. And so my understanding of these systems is that, if you're not there to clear it every couple months or once a year or whatever, then the invasive vegetation is going to come right back and take over. And so as a result, the Alae'ula is what we call sort of a conservation-dependent species or a management-dependent species. So there has to be someone there all the time to sort of care for the land. But if, for example, I see Alae'ula on a lot of private land, with small wetlands and things like that. And if we can get people interested, especially private landowners, in maintaining these landscapes specifically for Alae'ula, or just putting in some time once a year to clear out vegetation or make some adjustments, that might be really a huge, huge conservation impact for the bird.
Now I see, you really talk about the whole stewardship and clearing out vegetation. So I mean, how important it is to really clear out the vegetation to provide that habitat for the Alae'ula?
It's pretty huge. I mean, I think if they're going to be breeding, they absolutely need to have that sort of interspersion, because what they're looking for a separate place to feed, which can be almost anywhere. It can be a lawn, it can be a driveway, as long as there's food there. But they need this dense vegetation to breed in, but they need clear area around it so they can see predators coming. And they need deeper water around it also so they can run away from their predators, because they're a little bit faster in the water than a lot of the things that would eat their chicks. And so it's kind of a safe zone for them, and that really makes them feel like they can go ahead and start breeding.
Okay, and then, I mean, if for a lot of the audience, including myself, could you, may elaborate more about the Alae'ula as far as, their lifespan and, basically how, their life
history, so the biology side, We're still, I mean, they're such a secretive bird that we're really trying to get a feel of that now. And that's part of why we're doing this banding study that we'll be talking about, is that when we mark these birds individually, we can keep track of an individual bird throughout their lifetime. And what we noticed in their life history so far is they probably live between 4 and 6 years, something like that. Not positive yet. We have some indication that their lifespans sort of differ depending on where you are. So up at James Campbell, which is where we were seeing pictures of, this is sort of this Alae'ula paradise. There are so many of them there, we think they might not live as long because they're so busy fighting each other and doing whatever. But they make so many babies in that time, the population does better. There are some birds at Waimea Valley, up near Haleiwa, those birds, we have actually the oldest Alae'ula on record is there, and I think she's maybe 8 or 9 years old. I have to confirm that. And so potentially in sort of a more captivity situation, they can live a lot longer because there aren't so many stresses of, fighting other Alae'ula or anything like that. So they don't have a tremendously long lifespan, but they can really do a lot in that time, which is neat.
Right.
And speaking of doing a lot, so they tend to lay a clutch of 4 eggs in the nest, and usually, on average, on Oahu, the typical is about 2 to 3 babies survive. Sometimes we see down to 1, but typically they have at least a chick survive every brood, and they really seem to breed whenever they want. Okay. I have not found any way to predict their nesting behavior. They just sort of, one day they just, okay, let's do it, and they just build a nest and there it is, boom. Right. It just seems, I haven't heard anybody who's been able to predict that, and the people in my lab have had the same problem. So it's pretty random, but they have, they can have a couple clutches in a year. They make a few babies every year. And one thing I think that's really nice is they also kind of have this ohana dynamic where they'll have older chicks from last year, the year before. They'll stay at home sometimes and help their parents raise the next kind of, generation, which is really cool. And
how long's their growing up period from a chick to a regular adult Alae'ula?
It depends on sort of what part of their body you're talking about. So they like to run so much that their feet are incredibly important. And I see adult-sized feet in a couple months on these birds. The wings take a very long time. They're like little dinosaurs. They'll have big red, feet and be running around a couple days after being out of the nest. But I would say it probably takes 4 or 5 months to start seeing, adult wings and plumage, and then even longer for their facial shield to start coming in.
Oh, okay. Now, you talked about earlier, about the whole tracking and research, process. I'm guessing you'll have to, capture the birds and track it. And I think that's a quite interesting, process.
Yeah, it's an interesting process, and it's a pretty difficult process. The main way we capture the birds is using a walk-in trap, which is it's kind of a humane trap. It's what people tend to use for catching cats and raccoons and stuff like that back in the mainland. It's a little cage with a trigger inside, and what we do is we put some attractive food item in there. We leave it in the wetlands for a time. Typically, we'll wire the trap open so that it can't actually close and trap anything. And then once the birds get comfortable going in and out, we'll go and wait near the trap, take off the wire and wait till the bird gets trapped. Then take them out, give them their color bands, take the genetic sample by taking some feathers from their belly, and then we'll take our measurements and things like that, and then we'll kind of send them on their way.
Okay. Now, as far as the tracking, so how do you keep track? Is it basically just based on, is it a digital tracker, or how does?
So to begin with, we were just super old school, and we would give each bird a combination of 4 color bands, plastic bands on their legs. And those color bands would tell you something about that bird. Each bird would have its own combination of 4 bands. And those birds are all over the island. People can see those and report back to us. And we're still banding birds. And that's just sort of the bread and butter of any movement study. It's just being able to say, I saw the bird with the red over blue in this place.
And how can members of the public or people who just care about the Alae'ula or birds in general help out with this endeavor?
And so this is also an excellent plug for my part. So we're running sort of a project trying to get people to recite these banded birds. I think the URL will come up at the end of the show. But we have a project website that's sites.tufts.edu/Hawaiian moorhen. And essentially, people can go out to wetlands where these birds are occurring. And there's a guide on the website which talks about different wetlands people can go to, places we've banded the birds. And you can just look with binoculars or even sometimes bare eyes, depending how shy the birds are, to see these color bands. And then it's easy to just report them on the website. We actually have a little app where people can go and type in the color bands of the birds they saw. That goes directly to us. And actually, we're working on publishing some papers right now that are using those data. So we're already using information that volunteers have given us, and that's going to be published scientific research. So it's an excellent way to go out, watch the birds, have a good time, but also be helping a species by really improving the science that tells us how to take care of them.
Right. And it's obviously difficult for most people to really comprehend. But once this research gets published, what's really next, or what's really the next steps once what were the findings after this 3-year-long research process goes.
Well, so once this research starts to get published, a lot of the work I'm doing is already in collaboration with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and a lot of the questions I'm asking are things that they're really hoping to need answers for, which is why we're working together. So as this work gets published, it's sort of in a direct line to the people in charge of a lot of these big properties. it's going directly to them, and they're going to say, okay, well, these are the conservation
Right.
implications of this work. You know, if they're not moving, okay, how do we make them move? Do we have to move them ourselves? Should we find ways to create corridors for them to move? Things like that. So it's all, it's because we're so connected with the federal government and the state government right now, and also, you know, NGOs like the Livable Hawaii Kai Hui, because we're working with those people right now on a face-to-face basis, that information will be readily available to property managers, and they can, of course, start to alter their management and take action to sort of help improve
Right.
the situation for the species using that information. So that's nice. I feel fortunate that we don't have to go trying to push this paper on people. We can, we're publishing it alongside these people by collaborating with them, and so that makes it a very direct connection, which is great.
Now, I mean, you talk about all these, different organizations, really partnering. And I mean, as for you as a PhD candidate, how did you, reach out and really get connected with all these different organizations? And I mean, I really am quite curious. I mean, there's so much research, that you just shared, but really just the whole process of doing it. I mean, it must be a heck of a lot of work.
Yeah, it's been an interesting combination of things. I've definitely been doing a lot more phone calls and chatting with people than I pictured when I first came to do research on these birds. I thought I'd just be outside getting sunburnt and grabbing birds all day, which I've been doing plenty of that. But in terms of getting in touch with people, it was a combination of things. I had some groups get in touch with me. So actually, Elizabeth, I think, called me my first year here, saying, hey, you do ʻAlaeʻula research. We have ʻAlaeʻula. Can we talk? And that was phenomenal. I never would have known otherwise. A lot of other folks I work with are colleagues of my advisors or colleagues of friends of mine. There's just been a lot of sort of social networking going on, where I try to ask people on the island, oh, who do you know that does this or whatever, and then slowly get in touch with folks. And I mean, the conservation community is just filled with really, enthusiastic, smart people. And so it's always people who are really great to talk to and eager to introduce you to the next person, et cetera. So that's made it a lot easier than I thought it would be.
Right. And then for that part, I mean, because you're from, born and raised in Connecticut, I believe.
Boston, yeah.
Boston.
Yeah, close enough.
But how does this, really makes Hawaii unique, compared to maybe other places?
Yeah. So from a conservation community perspective, I think one thing that Hawaii has, being so small, is a lot of these species that are not found anywhere else.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's also there's a very old cultural attachment to a lot of these species. Right. There's sort of a different spiritual outlook on what these species mean. Being ancestors and things like that, and that makes a much more powerful sort of conservation ethos that I think ties people together. It just feels like less of a dry academic environment and more of just a really exciting, vibrant community of people who are just really gung-ho passionate about this stuff.
Right.
I think that's made Hawaii different for me is the level of enthusiasm and a different kind of involvement, which I think is fun. Yeah. And
if you might, what's really your daily routine as a researcher when you come out here for your summer study?
Right. Super exhausting. So, a good example is like the past week or so, typically getting up at 5 in the morning, going out to whatever field site I'm working at. We're opening traps. We're trying to figure out where the birds are. We're trying to see banded birds. Hopefully we catch a couple, right? And then we take their measurements. We do all the things we discussed before. And so that's usually maybe 5 in the morning until 3 or 4 in the afternoon, depending on what we've got going on. And then afternoon time, if I can manage to not take a nap, then I'll be, reading some literature, trying to understand what else might be going on with the species, trying to analyze the data we have, work on manuscripts. And like you said, a tremendous amount of calling property owners and asking, oh, hey, when can I show up? We work at golf courses a lot, and specifically, up in Turtle Bay and the Olamana golf links. And those land managers are just so incredibly tolerant of just having these, nerds show up and bother them doing research on birds. And so I'm trying to like network with them and keep in touch. Okay, when's a good time? Do you have a tournament this weekend? Can we sneak in and look at some birds? And so there's a lot of sort of, I think the biggest challenge for me is scheduling. I'm usually only here for 2 months or 10 weeks or whatever, and I'm just trying to cram so much in. And so there's a lot of planning and then a lot of downtime outside catching birds.
And besides the whole just going out on the field, what else comes right after that as far as the comprehension and taking that data and processing everything?
Well, a lot of that happens after I leave Hawaii.
Right.
So one major thing I've done the last 2 years is with the genetic data that we collect. I go to the USGS lab in Alaska, in Anchorage, where they happen to have a lot of the tools we need to study this bird particularly, because they collaborate directly with some U.S. Fish and Wildlife people here. So I typically go to Alaska, and then all of a sudden, I'm trading in my hiking boots for a lab coat and goggles, and I'm sitting there, doing lab work and running DNA extractions and blah blah blah, and feeling like a real scientist,
Right.
And that's really a lot of fun. And then throughout the rest of the school year, when I'm back in Boston,
Right.
I'm typically teaching a lot to keep my PhD support, and writing lots of grant proposals. Always looking to get lots of funding to come out here and do my work. And fortunately, every year so far, we've managed to get support from a lot of great organizations that are interested in our conservation work.
I'm quite curious about Alaska for your lab part.
And what specifically I do there?
What specifically is out there in Alaska?
Yeah, so they've just got a big genetics lab there.
Right.
And I think this was another thing that was just a product of social networking, is that I knew I wanted to do a study on population genetics, because it's a really interesting tool to understand the movement of the birds. We were having so much trouble seeing the birds. So it's okay, well, how do we understand the movement without seeing them? Oh, understand where the genes go, right? You don't have to see it happen. And so the woman that I study with up there, the scientist, she is a close colleague and former classmate of my main collaborator, Jared Underwood, who works with the Fish and Wildlife Service here. And so he said, oh, well, you got to go, talk to her. I'm already writing a paper with her on Alae'ula genetics. Why don't you just go work with her? And then, of course, her and her husband were just absolutely fabulous, and they took me in, and they've been training me in genetic techniques, and et cetera. And it's always a big change, too, to come from here and go there. It'll be late August and cold, so it's interesting.
And how long have you spent in Alaska?
Last year, I spent a while. I was there for 6 weeks because I was really trying to learn all the techniques. And I still have a lot to learn, but this year is probably only about 3 weeks, just to finish up some of the last touches on the work we're doing. And then I'm headed to DC for a big bird conference to start discussing the research. So.
And now, we only have a couple more minutes left on our show, and we've just touched upon a ton of topics, but I just wanted to come back to Hawaii and Keawāwa Wetland as far as moving forward. What's next for the restoration efforts?
Mm-hmm. I think it's going to depend on what specifically the Hui is dealing with at that time. And I think there's a lot when you're dealing with a property of that kind of importance and that sort of location. There's a lot that needs to be done to make any sort of changes. And I know that there are efforts to get an anti-predator fence going on and things like that, and of course managing the rest of the rest of the landscape and doing a lot of trapping and things like that. And so I anticipate that's going to be a big undertaking, and it's going to make a big difference. Is getting rid of the predators is always the biggest and most important step for the species. I think after that happens, I'm interested in helping draft a habitat enhancement plan or a conservation plan for the wetland to try to advise on what can be done with what's there. What I'd like to see is to have some of the reeds cleared, have that nice patchy, funny-looking landscape set up. Because with the amount of area that's there, when that habitat gets enhanced that way, when there's enough to forage on, when there are enough small patches to hide in, the birds are going to go nuts. And there are probably going to be birds coming in from elsewhere.
And lastly, we have 1 minute left, but specifically, what predators are out there that does, pose and an obstacle.
Mm-hmm. The biggest one is probably the small Indian mongoose.
Right.
But they're, domestic cats are a huge problem, and they're a bigger problem because people like them so much. People don't necessarily like the mongoose, but the cats, it's hard not to feed a cat if you see it on the street or whatever, and that causes problems. And I understand that turtles have been a problem at Hawaii and Keawāwa, as people releasing their pet turtles in the wetland. Big no-no, causes big problems. Hope they don't do that anymore. But.
Well, Charles, that was a great interview, and I wish you the best on the rest of your research.
Thanks so much, Kendrick. Nice chatting with you.
Well, anyways, mahalo for joining us for another episode of Maunalua Past, Present, and Future. This is towards the end of the show, and before signing off, we do want to thank Kaimuki Ōlelo for putting it on, as well as Livable Hawaii Kai Hui for sponsoring this monthly segment. Again, my name is Kendrick Chang, a youth advisor for Livable Hawaii Kai Hui, signing off.